Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Oh, Tony, we've gotten some very nice reviews recently on our podcast platforms, the various podcast platforms for the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. And today we get to pay one of those listeners back. He had left us a very nice 5-star review. Thank you, Glimidol, one of those, and asked us a question in the 5-star review, and we thought, all right, we can work with this. We can answer this question, and it's kind of an interesting question, and it's probably going to take up a whole show. But if you want to leave us a 5-star review and a nice rating, we will. And you want to have a question you want us to answer? Well, we might just do that for you as well.
And what was the question?
The question was, I'm very concerned that the number of injuries on this team has been excessive. Is that true relative to other teams? Do we need to take a very hard look at the quality of the Buckeyes training program? Does it need to be revamped? Is it dated and not taking advantage of current knowledge?
And what we've done is gone back and looked at some numbers, but it's without like a team of people, it's kind of impossible to look at other programs specifically. For one, you don't necessarily know the teams well enough to know who has even been missing and things like that. But what we have done is gone back and looked at previous years for the Buckeyes and seen how things have gone. And based on the findings and the facts, like last year was, I'd say, the most injury-riddled year for Ohio State since at least 2014, because I went back to the last time they installed new turf, because I wanted to see, hey, the last time they installed new turf was 2014. Were there a bunch of injuries there as the turf gets broken in and things like that? And there weren't, but we'll get to that in a bit. But so last year, and what I did is I just like how many starters missed games and how many starter games were missed. And last year there were around roughly 33 games missed by starters. 14 different starters missed games, which is quite a lot. Obviously Jackson Smith-Njigba was 10 of those, but Travion Henderson missed 5, Mayan Williams missed 2, Julian Fleming missed 2, and you had 5 guys miss a game. You had Denzel Burke and Josh Proctor also missed a couple of games, and Cam Brown was in there. So yeah, there were a bunch of missed games for starters. But Tom, it's not just the starters. You could throw Evan Pryor's entire season, Mitchell Melton's entire season. So you could probably maybe even double the 33 games lost when you include some guys that would have played, and then maybe have that and increase it because of all the guys that were playing injured, like Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson. So last year, I think by every metric was just the most injury-riddled season based on the numbers that I found, but also based on my recollection.
Yeah, I mean, it was a year when it felt like they constantly had a ton of guys hurt. And I think part of that was probably that a lot of that was clustered in the cornerback room and in the running back room, where it wasn't, oh, you lost one guy on the offensive line and one guy on the defensive line and one of the linebackers and one of the corners. It was, you're playing your true freshman, probably number 4 or 5 on the depth chart, cornerback as a starter against Wisconsin a weekend or a month in because everyone's hurt, and you ended up with 4 different guys having meaningful numbers of carries as running backs, and another one who missed the whole season. So I think some of that was, it felt like more just for that reason, but numerically it was more. Now, I think the much more that I think is the first interesting question you had to answer. Was this really an abnormal number of injuries? And it feels like the answer is yes. And then the far more interesting question, and really the makeup of this whole show, is, okay, why? And some of those injuries, there was the new turf theory. There is, hey, they focus too much on strength and not enough on flexibility theory in terms of the conditioning program. There's all that kind of stuff. And you also kind of have to remember, sometimes these are just kind of weird injuries. Like the Jackson Smith-Njigba injury, for example, gets hit from behind, ends up with a hamstring injury that cost him the whole season, and was that they tried to bring him back too soon? Was that a function in how many games he missed? I mean, there's a lot of different factors that goes into all this, and we can do our best to dive into a bunch of those as we kind of move forward here.
Yeah, and even looking back at some of these, like some of the injuries occur on the road, but then you can argue, well, it's the build-up from all of the practice on the new turf, and the reason the turf itself became an issue is when Ohio State installed their new turf last year, they went with what is called a slit film artificial turf, as opposed to what other programs and other teams like in the NFL that just have monofilament fiber, monofilament. Tom, mono meaning one, filament meaning rail.
Mono meaning one, filament meaning filament. So yes, it is a one filament. I went in to look because I had read this whole thing, the whole idea from the NFLPA on why this was an issue and this new type of turf was causing more injuries. And one of the things that you sort of struggle with here is it's not like it looks like a Civil War battlefield out there with just bodies lying all over the place on the field. The difference in terms of, according to the NFLPA, in terms of the monofilament split film versus natural turf is like 2 to 3 injuries per stadium per year. So that's in the NFL, that might be 1 for the home team and 1 for the road team over the course of the year. And that kind of feels like noise almost in the numbers. Where is that a statistically meaningful amount? There were only 6 NFL stadiums, I believe, last year that had the split film turf. So you're not talking about huge numbers. But if the numbers are higher, okay, how real is that? And why is that an issue? And the answer on the why is kind of interesting. It's because of how that turf is actually made. The big difference is monofilament is basically it looks like grass. There is a piece of turf just sort of sticking up, and it's a one piece of turf, and it just looks like a blade of grass, and there's just a whole bunch of them, obviously. The slit film turf is, each one of those is kind of basically like one of those, but the blade is split. It's kind of like cut. So it looks kind of like a little bit of a mesh, or if you're sort of braiding something together almost, where it's, instead of just being one solid piece of little plastic fake grass, it's cut into a couple different pieces. And the thing that they, if they are trying to sell you monofilament turf, there's a slit film turf, they will tell you the slit film turf holds the field, the rubber, the little chopped up tires, or whatever the kind of rubber infill is, holds that down better. The tips of the grass will split more with use than a monofilament was, which will lead to a softer surface long term. So that's the pro. Now, here's the con. The NFL says that because there's all those little tiny slits in there, it makes it more likely that you're going to catch something. You're going to, your cleats catch in that material, in that little slit in the grass, and it just creates just a little bit more resistance, and maybe your foot sticks a little bit more, and that's where you see the video of the guy's knee bending sideways. Now, if you have a 250, 300-pound person running at you and crashing into you at 10 miles an hour, there is a whole bunch of force involved in that is not the cleat catching in the grass, but it is a little more resistance. It's a little, and is that just the straw that breaks the camel's back in some of these cases? That's kind of the question, and you're not getting a concise, a definitive answer from everyone on this. There is not like a consensus here. The NFLPA feels pretty strongly that this is the issue, or an issue anyway. But you've got teams who are saying, like, yeah, it's not, is this really that big of an issue? Maybe, maybe not. How much of that is they don't want to pay $5 million or whatever it is to replace their field that they just put in a year or two ago? Maybe some of that. After the last NFL season, they replaced the turf, the slit film turf in Detroit where the Lions play, and replaced it with monofilament. They also replaced the one in East Rutherford, New Jersey, where the Giants and Jets play. So instead of 6 NFL stadiums with this slit film turf, next year there's going to be 4. So, people are taking this seriously enough that they're doing something about it, but they're not taking it so seriously that they've passed a rule and banned this stuff. So it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, there could be something here, but I don't think it's so definitive that you can definitely point to it and say, yes, this is the issue, period, full stop.
Well, and I remember when this was the hubbub back in the fall, reading different stories about the slip film and the numbers and the studies. What I remember reading is that there are more non-contact injuries with the slip film, minor, quote unquote, minor injuries, more severe injuries on monofilament or other types of turf, like an ACL or things like that. And the slip film decreases your odds of a season-ending injury, but maybe increases your odds of a season-lasting injury. And both of those are bad. But again, the numbers still are pretty low. What I think people may have forgotten is how much everybody hated the field in 2021 and how everybody was excited for new turf because everybody was slipping in 2021. Players were complaining. And then so the turf goes in prior to spring ball last year, right? Prior to spring ball or after spring ball?
I think it was after. I'm currently madly scrolling through my photo.
May or June.
Yeah, I think it was after. I believe it was after.
And then, it was after, because we're talking to the players in fall camp. Jackson Smith and Jigba back in August said it looks good and it feels good, so we're ready to bounce around on it. Being out there, I'm just more confident in my cuts. For real, we were kind of slipping a little bit last year, so there's just more confidence in the surface. It's good to always have that. Of course, he missed 10 games. Travion Henderson, who missed 5 games and was injured in others, he said of the turf, it's way better, way better. I'm glad they finally got that done. It was slippery sometimes. I would roll my ankle out of nowhere, and he's talking about the old turf. And now that doesn't happen. And they've been practicing on a new turf, and it feels great. It's softer. A lot of the turf last year was very hard. It's a safety thing, and we're able to cut better and stuff. And so anytime you're able to cut better, you're also able to get stuck better, worse, if you will. I still go back to being a Bears fan. Wendell Davis was a receiver in the late 80s who went up for a catch and came down and both of his cleats caught in the turf, and he blew out both ACLs on one play. And that was it for his career, basically. And yeah, it's great to be able to cut, but it's also great for there to be some give. And that's why, grass fields are safer and the dirt will give. And the slip film is made to give less. You're even talking about it's made to keep the rubber pellets down better, and the rubber pellets are there for you to be able to grip better. And so it's designed to be stickier, but also with that stickiness, there is some danger, but not so much that it's dangerous. Yes, it's more dangerous, but it's not dangerous per se.
And I think it's worth noting, it did go in after spring ball last year. That was last June. I was taking pictures of the stadium with the new turf going in. So last year, when Mitchell Melton blew out his knee on the turf at Ohio Stadium, that was on the old monofilament, sort of worn out, slick turf that everyone was complaining didn't grip well enough. And then he had a non-contact knee injury on that. So I think this is one of those things where you look at the turf and it's like, well, how does this turf perform? And it's like, well, okay, the turf performs one way when it's brand new, and a year or two later, it will perform a little bit differently because some of those filaments will be split up. It'll be a softer field. Maybe will it be as sticky or allow you to plant as much? A year or two from now, I guess we'll all find out together. But if your complaint on the old turf was it's slippery, then yes, this is absolutely going to be performing better than the old one did. It feels like we're talking, when we're talking about the models, the NFL model said, quote, models suggest there are 2 to 3 more non-contact lower extremity injuries per season per stadium on slip film surfaces than other types of synthetic turf fields. Again, this is 2 to 3 more injuries over the course of a year, which it's a lot. If you're one of those guys, boy, it's a lot. But it's also, there are so few of these, and I don't know that this has been studied at the college level. I'm not aware of any studies at the college level. So you're just doing six stadiums, 2 to 3 more. That could be statistical noise, or there really could be something there. It's just, you're dealing with such small sample sizes that it feels like there's something there, but I would not be so confident that I would definitely point to this and say, this is absolutely the issue. But it could be. Now, will it still be the issue a year or two from now if they keep playing on this field and the stuff breaks down a little bit more and then maybe it doesn't catch as much? Well, maybe. We don't know. And I go back to when Ohio State was playing in the Fiesta Bowl against Clemson a few years ago. That was on a grass field. And that field was terrible. People were sliding all over the place. They were taking up huge chunks of grass. Think about Ohio Stadium for the Michigan game in 2006, when it's the game of the century, 1 versus 2, and the field is in horrendous shape. They couldn't get the grass to grow right. And, now you're at the point where you're, potentially going to be playing college football playoff games into December. And so can they even make a grass field work in Ohio Stadium right now? Maybe, but, you're probably, it feels like you've got, enough pros and cons to each of these different kinds of surfaces that I don't know that I could definitively point to one and say this is absolutely what they should do moving forward. It's just such a weird and difficult situation, and without actually being able to do a real study on it, or having someone else do a real study on it, I don't know how confident I could be that there's a definitive answer here.
And I didn't do a real study on it, but I read some stuff on the internet. And from my experience, they're basically the same. But what I was reading about this champion, this greatest turf ever, and it was a monofilament, and basically it was judged so good because they ran it through, like 40,000 tests, and it never showed any wear and tear. Whereas like the slip film stuff is kind of designed to wear and tear in some sense. So it's interesting, just the different theories on what is the best kind of turf and what works, in terms of the blades of grass, and just to have an idea in your mind's eye of what the slip film turf looks like. You can just take a regular blade of grass and cut a couple of slits in each one, and just maneuver it and bend it, and you'll see the holes pop out, and there's some kind of lattice work type of thing going on there. But it will be interesting to see what this year looks like. Because was last year just a blip? And you look the year before, now that you're playing on different surfaces and you're practicing on different surfaces, if the numbers stay the same and they don't start to drop, then you've got an issue. And Mickey Marotti, we talked to him back at the end of May with the rest of the Ohio State assistant coaches, and they said they look at injuries every year. They do their studies, they do their analysis, and I guess at this point you're just chalking it up to it. It was just not a fluke, but it's just one of those years, I think is the best way to put it. It's just one of those years. But if you keep having one of those years, you can't let it become, it's just one of those decades, because there's no such thing. Because in a moment, we're going to talk about some of the past years where it was crazy, the number of injuries that there weren't compared to the number of injuries that there are now. And I'll just even mention 2021. So in 2022, there were around 33 games lost for starters. 2021, there were around 28. So that's two different fields, and the numbers aren't far off, but just the number of different injuries and other non-starters missing injuries last year, it makes it a larger number overall. But if the numbers stay in the high 20s, low 30s, what's the next step? And I think it involves a heavy analysis into the strength and conditioning, right?
Yeah, well, if you start having historically anomalous numbers, anomalously high numbers every year, then at some point it stops being a coincidence. And is that the turf? Is that something you are doing or not doing in your strength and conditioning program? It's something. At some point it stops being a coincidence. You don't if you flip a coin 10 times and it comes up heads 6, 7, 8, 9 times in a row, at some point that becomes meaningful. If you flip a coin twice and it comes up heads twice, okay, it came up heads twice. If you flip a coin 5, 6, 7 times and it comes up heads and heads and heads and heads, okay, at some point there's something weird with this coin. With the injuries, if you have one weird season, maybe you had one weird season. If you have another historically anomalously high season here, okay, then there probably is something you got to look at. And I think you are looking at the turf again, and you got to look at also what kinds of injuries are you having. Because, for example, Mayan Williams had an injury at Penn State where his hand got caught or his finger got caught in the first down chain. That's not because of the slit film turf. That's not because of strength and conditioning. Like, that's just one of those things where you start to look at stuff and, is it a conditioning thing or something to do with the strength and conditioning program or potentially with the turf? Do you have a bunch of soft tissue issues? Is it constant groin injuries? Is it constant hamstring injuries? That kind of stuff where it might be, hey, you need to put more focus on flexibility. Back at the Peach Bowl, Kirby Smart, the second time we got to go watch Georgia practice, they opened up the last 15 minutes of practice, and it was Georgia and all their football players doing yoga. And, at the time, I know my reaction was, number one, this is completely hilarious because this is Kirby Smart just trolling because he doesn't like the media and he doesn't want to show us any kind of actual football. But it was also, hey, that's really interesting. I wonder how much yoga stuff, flexibility stuff Ohio State does, because if you're having soft tissue, muscle pull kind of injuries constantly, then maybe you do need to look at that. That's something that, as always, there's a negative Mets example here. The Mets, about 8 to 10 years ago, brought in Mike Barwis, the former Michigan strength and conditioning guru, who was going to completely revolutionize Michigan football. And they were basically going to turn into the Incredible Hulk when Rich Rod brought him in. How did that turn out? Well, we're out of time. We don't have time to talk about that. But the Mets brought in this guy, and he ended up doing basically football-style strength training for baseball players. And that was okay, and guys started hitting the baseball further, but also they had started having a bunch of lat issues and muscle strains and pulls in areas where they didn't necessarily usually have them because you're maybe a little more stiff, you're not as flexible as you might have been, and so that ends up creating more issues down the line. So you look at the injuries that they had last year, some of them are, you had guys with hamstring issues last year, but it wasn't all the same kinds of issues. So how much do you want to chalk up to, they're not doing enough flexibility stuff versus they're not doing enough speed stuff versus not doing enough strength stuff, whatever. I mean, that it's really like a case by case basis. And with as weird and secretive as Ohio State is about injuries, I don't know that I feel like I have enough information about the very specifics of all of the injuries to be able to say, yes, there's a definitive trend here, or no, there's nothing to it.
No, and that's absolutely right. Every instance is specific to itself and different. That's information we don't have. So you see these 9 guys, they're injured, and it's like, well, clearly strength and conditioning needs to be doing something about this, or maybe they're doing something incorrect. And it's like, well, one injury might have been a back pull, that had nothing to do with anything else. And one might be chronic knee issue that he came to Ohio State with. And so there are ways I'm sure that you could explain away the bulk of this as to why it doesn't pertain to this blame or that blame. Again, if it happens, you'll definitely, you look at the turf, you look at the methods that they're using. I also think, Tom, some players are just injury prone. And also when you lose a guy for a season, that jacks the number up, because we've already said 33 games roughly last year missed. That's one guy missing a season. And that was Jackson Smith and Jigba, basically. And it doesn't take much for one guy to miss a season and then really raise those numbers. Like Josh Proctor missed 11 games in 2021. COVID was 2020, but Jonathan Cooper missing 9 games in 2019. Nick Bosa, 11 games in 2018. Brandon Bowen, 8 games in 2017. 2016, you lose both Tracy Sprinkle and Dante Booker early on. So right there, that's, 20 games for those guys. Of course, in 2016, those were the only 2 starters that ended up missing games, which is incredible. And those guys get replaced. Tracy Sprinkle gets replaced by Draymond Jones. Dante Booker gets replaced by Jerome Baker. Like, not bad. But when you look at this, and I want to go back to 2014, which is the first year of the new turf. They lost about 4 games for starters that year, and 3 of those were JT Barrett. And the same 5 starting offensive linemen started all year long. Every defensive starter played all 15 games. And so go back to that turf, man. Get that turf again. Because we've talked in the years past, like, how amazing it would be, how amazing it was when every starter on the offensive line played every game. And it's happened a couple of times. Hasn't happened lately, but I don't think it has, but like for a while there, it was customary that those guys played every game. And just 2014, a season that was known for a specific injury, should be known for having almost no injuries outside of that one.
Yeah, it was, 4 games lost for starters, except for the fact that the starting quarterback missed the whole season with a shoulder injury.
Oh, yeah.
And then
there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's like, how do you want to calculate this? This is, and, that was a shoulder injury. So that very clearly was not turf related, but, that's a, and then JT Barrett breaks his ankle. And is that because his foot stuck in the turf on the new turf at Ohio Stadium? I don't know. It's just, and I think the other piece of this that makes making a real definitive declaration that this has gotten much worse. The general trend has been, based on the way it's calculated here, it has gotten worse. 4 games in 2014, 3 games in 2015, 21 in 2016. And that was basically 2 guys, but it was the whole season, more or less, for 2 guys. 2017, there were 22. 2018, there were 26. 2019, there's 22. 2020 was the weird COVID years. We'll leave that out. 2021 is 28 games. 2022 is 33 games. Now, how much of that is they're being a little more cautious with people? How many times have we seen Julian Fleming is a game time decision and, well, it rained at Indiana, so they're not going to play Julian Fleming at Indiana? Is that, are they being more cautious with head injuries? Is, the change of the concussion protocol that's come over the last 10 years or so? How much does that potentially play into this? This is, I think, something where it feels like there is something to the data here. I think the most interesting thing we've discussed so far of anything is, boy, there does seem to be a trend towards more injuries. Generally, the curve is kind of going up. However, we're talking about how are we defining this? Braxton Miller doesn't count for 2014, but because the Tracy Sprinkle and Dante Booker were in there in 2016, they do count. I mean, it's you run into all sorts of how are we defining terms kind of issues here, which makes drawing a real firm conclusion difficult to impossible. But it feels like there's probably something to the increasing number of injuries. Just the fact that curve does seem to kind of be going up as you go.
And it would be pretty shocking if it went back down to like a 2014. And that's completely on me. I never once thought about Braxton Miller as I was putting that because I don't incorporate him with the 2014 team. It's just.
Well, how did he get hurt? He was hurt at the end of? Wasn't he hurt in the Orange Bowl the year before that? And then he was kind of recovering. So, he got hurt in the Orange Bowl. Okay, that was on a natural grass turf. I don't remember if that was like he got driven into the ground or did he get driven into the ground? Okay, so, that's like one of those things that happens sometimes. And so you can't really hold, that's not a conditioning issue. That's not a turf issue. That's one of those things. But, and then you go back and unless you want to dive deep into exactly when and where these guys got hurt, last year you go through and, what was the play where this guy got hurt? Or was it, Jordan Hancock got hurt during fall camp. He was hurt, before anything started. Now, I don't know that we've ever gotten an answer on, what was he doing? It was a hamstring thing, but what was he doing at the time that the hamstring, was he just kind of jogging, running? Was he twisting, turning? Was he covering someone in practice? I don't know that we've actually gotten the answer on that. So, there's so much you got to dive into here that if you're looking for something to make you think that there's not a clear systemic issue, Ohio State, Ryan Day, they are incentivized, if there is a systemic issue that is causing these problems, these injuries, they are incentivized to fix it. There's nothing that is in Ryan Day's interest to hide, hey, oh, well, actually there is a very clear problem and it's this, but we don't want to, don't tell anyone. We're going to keep this a secret. They're incentivized to solve the issue. So that, to me, I'm not the biggest defer to authority person in the history of the world, but this is just like, let's understand the motives here. The motive is their best interest is to solve this issue if there is a clear issue. I am sure they have done study on this. They do study on all this kind of stuff. They will never release the results of that study. That's just, that's how that goes. But if they found something that was a pretty clear through line to a lot of these injuries, well, I think they would probably be doing something to address it. And I don't think we've heard anything definitive on them doing something to address anything.
And I think, again, a good percentage of this number may just be players who are prone to injury, who have been injured repeatedly in a number of seasons, like a Cam Brown, who has missed games throughout his career. There are just some guys that have that kind of luck, bad luck. You mentioned where some of these injuries happen. Like in 2018, Austin Mack missed the final 6 games of the season because of an injury at Purdue. Nick Bosa injured at Jerry World. So it's not just stuff that happens. And of course, that was a much safer turf at Ohio Stadium at the time. Anyway, we know that, but it's a little bit of a joke. But so this is where things are now. If things go wonky again, like Ryan Day is going to have to answer some questions, and he's going to be, as you said, looking for those answers, because you go out and recruit all of this talent and you have everything the way you want it now. Your defensive coordinator is here for a second year. You're running the same defense. Everything is ready to go. You've got everything set, and it just gets derailed because of injuries. You need to figure out why. And if it's the turf, doesn't matter. Like Ryan Day, take it out of my checkbook for that $6 million to replace it. I'm not doing this anymore. Or if it's strength and conditioning, that's you're going to have to deal with that. Or if it's just injury prone players, we have to move on from them, and you've got to fix it. And if it's just one thing after another every single year you're dealing with this, that's no way to live. And the injuries happen. It's football. I think that should be the beginning and the end of the show. Injuries happen. It's football. But if there are things you can do to prevent the stuff that isn't necessarily happening to everybody else, then you need to figure that out.
Yeah, and just, continue to monitor this stuff. I always go back to Jim Tressel when he got to Ohio State, doing a study of Ohio Stadium and the winds in Ohio Stadium at various times of day and various times of year, to just in terms of taking that into account when he's talking about punting and that kind of stuff. I assure you, they have done rigorous study on this to try to identify some of the issues. And the fact that we haven't heard anything like real definitive, like major changes coming to the program, makes me think that they have not found anything that is a very clear and decisive answer on this. But you keep an eye on it moving forward. And if there's another year where they're losing a bunch of guys and you potentially lose a game because you have a bunch of guys hurt and, you're running out your, there's no Mayan Williams and there's no Travion Henderson for the Michigan game again this year. Well, if you have another year like that and you potentially have something that costs you a game where it's just injury costing you a game, that's something that they, no one at Ohio State likes to lose. That is true of fans. That is true of players and coaches. That is true of administrators. That is true of everyone. So if there is something that is causing them to lose or causing them to not perform at the level that they want to perform at, they will find a way to address it. So just kind of watch this space, I guess, and we'll see. if this is an injury-free year, you won't hear split film turf coming out of anyone's mouth at any point this fall. And the first time someone rolls an ankle or blows out a knee, you will undoubtedly hear about it again. And it depends on how many times does that happen. You're going to have it's football, as you said. You're going to have injuries. Just is it a real anomaly in terms of the number of injuries, or is it just kind of sometimes bad stuff happens. That's how football goes.
I do wonder, and we'll wrap up, but I do wonder if we are far enough removed from COVID that you can't blame the two biggest number of injuries, games missed by starters, 2021-22. If we aren't going to blame that on COVID. COVID has impacted so much. You talk to the coaches and strength coaches, like they still will tell you that the damage that it has had on the program. I wonder if they might point at the injuries the last 2 years as something. And the way you're just looking for answers. Is it grasping at straws? Maybe. But it will be interesting to see what the numbers look like this season. Hopefully for everybody on the field, much lower than what the trend has been going. So that will do it for this episode. Want to thank you all for joining us. As always, find us at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Become a member. Find us there as well on the message board. Check out all of the premium content, recruiting updates, things of that nature from the entire team here at Buckeye Huddle. Also, find us at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle and facebook.com/Buckeye Huddle. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you guys later.